side of that is the health issues. There are some individuals that have raised health concerns on 5G deployment and radiation. How are you getting information out on both of those to make sure we're not making ourselves vulnerable to economic espionage, and we're also being attentive on any health concerns that individuals may have?
Thank you, Senator. With respect to the second issue, which I'll tackle first, we are not the health experts when it comes to these issues. We've consulted, of course, with the Federal Food and Drug Administration and with others who are responsible for determining what those standards should be. And we are confident that our standards are ones that are healthy for consumers.
The wireless industry is rolling out powerful 5G technology throughout the United States. However, some studies show a link between cell phone radiation and cancer. Dan Cohen has the story.
The race is on among cell phone providers to upgrade to 5th generation wireless technology, or 5G. That would require installation of new equipment across the U.S., a gargantuan effort every wireless company is already working on individually. 5G uses high-frequency waves that support faster speeds but don't travel as far, requiring a network of antennas built in closer proximity than the existing infrastructure. Wireless companies plan to use light poles, street lights, anything to minimize their expenses. But health experts worry about potential risks associated with exposure to radiation from cell phone antennas. Cell phones emit low levels of radio frequency energy, or RF. In 2011, the International Agency for Research on Cancer identified RF fields as, quote, possibly carcinogenic to humans. A study in Sweden found that Swedes who talked over cell or wireless phones for over 25 years were at 3 times the risk of developing glioma, a brain tumor that is often malignant, than those who use them for less than a year. And in March, a large-scale lifetime study of lab animals confirmed a link between cell tower radiation and cancer. The animals were exposed to levels legally permitted by the United States Federal Communications Commission. I discussed these studies with Dr. David Carpenter, director of the University of Albany's Institute for Health and the Environment.
They show a very significant increase in glioma and glioblastoma only on the side of the head where you use the cell phone regularly, and increasing with risk the longer you use it. They also have some evidence that the younger you are when you start to use the cell phone, the greater the risk.
Carpenter said these risks can be avoided by using the speaker function or an earpiece and keeping the phone a short distance away from all parts of the body. But the 5G rollout will effectively expose the entire population to dangerous effects.
The rollout of 5G is very frightening because what this is going to do is place a mini cell tower every 300 meters along every residential street in the country. And that's going to mean that nobody is going to be able to escape the radiation that comes from those 5G devices. If you walk down the sidewalk, if you live in a house there, you're going to be continuously exposed.
Countries like China, Italy, India, and Russia have far more stringent regulations over cell tower radiation than the United States.
Our regulators, dominated by physicists and engineers and not health effects people, ignore all of that evidence and therefore have standards that are totally unrealistic and out of date.
Reporting in Washington, Dan Cohen, RT.
And we are confident that our standards are ones that are healthy for consumers going forward.
The Ramazzini Institute in Italy just released a study. It says shows lab animals exposed to environmental levels of cell tower radiation can develop cancer. The Institute's study used exposures below the FCC limits, and its results mimic a $25 million study of much higher levels of cell phone radio frequency radiation from the U.S. National Toxicology Program.
We have had in the past a lot of wrong attitude, ignoring or discarding or discrediting good results. It is no more the time to do that.
The FDA says it has yet to review the Institute's study, but believes the current safety limits for cell phones are acceptable for protecting the public health.
And we are confident that our standards are ones that are healthy for consumers.
I want to be very clear. Industry has not said once that cell phones are safe. The federal government The various interagency working groups have all said it's safe.
A few weeks ago, I distributed sample data to each of you from scientific studies of the effects of radio frequency emissions compiled by bioinitiative.org that highlight the adverse health effects of various profiles of wireless transmissions. The adverse health effects identified by these studies are very serious. These effects include cancer, neurological problems, immune system disorders, and reproductive harm. It has been demonstrated that radio frequency radiation can have adverse impacts at the cellular level, including harmful mutations of human DNA. Most alarming of all is that children are most vulnerable to these adverse impacts, including children in the womb of pregnant mothers.
And we are confident that our standards are ones that are healthy for consumers.
It's the latest wake-up call about cell phone use, the largest federal study to date of the health risks of cell phone radiation. It found increased incidences of 11 different types of tumors in rodents exposed to levels of cell phone radiation that meet or exceed federal guidelines. Dr. Joel Moskowitz of UC Berkeley says even though they're just mice and rats, it's significant.
They almost always use mice and rats because they predict very well the effects on humans.
Primary finding in these studies was an increased incidence in malignant schwannomas of the heart in male rats. And Dr. Sesta will talk about this at great length in his talk. I don't want to steal much of his thunder, but this is a picture of the lesion that occurs right here and throughout here. The other thing that was observed here in the 2-year study that, as I mentioned, was also observed in the 14-day study is that we saw an increase in this right ventricular cardiomyopathy. And again, this is something that Dr. Sesta will talk about in further detail in his talk. But we did see that this was a statistically significant increase that occurred at the 3 and the 6 watt per kilogram exposures. This occurred both in males as well as females. Obviously, this occurred to a much lesser extent, but the background rate of this lesion seems to be lower in females as well. So this demonstrates then that the heart is likely is a target organ of RFR exposure.
But we're going to focus over here on the right ventricle. And these arrows are identifying regions where there's loss of some cardiomyocytes. And again, here's a normal right ventricle for comparison. But over here we see some shrunken cardiomyocytes here. And it's a few inflammatory cells scattered throughout here. And this was pretty typical of what we saw in this study for cardiomyopathy in the right ventricle. Obviously, some of the lesions were more extensive and extended farther down into the myocardium. Other animals had more foci, but this was fairly typical of what we saw.
Rick Adler. So a question now about the heart. I'm flagged by the incidence of right ventricular cardiomyopathy. And I'm comfortable in short-term toxicology studies that the left ventricular wall is more commonly affected with this. And so is it also true for 2-year studies in NTP's hands that the left ventricle is more the predominant site of spontaneous cardiomyopathy? You're nodding, but that's not going on the record, so I want you to, verbally say, yes, that's true.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly more prevalent and more obvious in the left ventricle.
It does occur in the right, but
yeah.
This study brings out that there's a preponderance of right ventricular cardiomyopathy occurring in males and also in females, which females tend to not have the spontaneous disease.
But we did see that this was a statistically significant increase that occurred at the 3 and the 6 watt per kilogram exposures. This occurred both in males as well as females. Obviously, this occurred to a much lesser extent, but the background rate of this lesion seems to be lower in females as well. So this demonstrates then that the heart is likely is a target organ of RFR exposure. And we are confident that our standards are ones that are healthy for consumers.